This video is an analytical review of Jojo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5 Golden Wind Vento Aureo Ougon no Kaze, whatever you want to call it. But I can't get footage of that show easily past YouTube's detection, and this video is very long. I don't want to edit 30 minutes and then be struggling to get it past the censors, so I'm going to be using footage from the 2002 video game adaptation of this same arc of the manga. Because it's gorgeous, I spent an entire 8-hour live stream beating it recently, and it's a lot of fun to look at, so hopefully that will be entertaining for you and you will understand that this is still a review of the anime. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a great series, and there really isn't much debate to be had on the matter. You might not like it, but there isn't a metric for greatness under which it fails to qualify. It's massive in scale and therefore great in size, it's enormously popular and therefore great by consensus quality judgment, and it is deeply influential and therefore great in cultural relevance. Whatever one person might not like about JoJo cannot slight its greatness, because it has impressed too many other people, in whichever ways it did, to have earned it the throne of its own greatness. There is no piece of art or expression which you could expect to be liked by even 50% of all people on Earth, and so greatness can only be gauged on contextual scales. In the grand scheme of things, most people have never heard of and probably wouldn't enjoy JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, nor any other specific comic book or television series or song or non-religious book or computers or shepherd's pie or even ramen noodles and kimchi. Besides maybe beds and blankets, rice, and the taste of chicken, there's only a handful of things I'd expect more than 50% of the Earth's population to know about and appreciate. In this sense, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is hardly the greatest thing since sliced bread, but if you listed every product of human ingenuity in our history, from most to least popular, I think it would land in the top 20%, the vital few things that deserve to be considered great by as objective a standard as could possibly exist. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has left a lot of strong impressions on me personally too, and I've developed an evolving relationship with it over the 13 or so years since I became aware of it. It's those impressions that I wish to share in this video, because I think any attempt to qualitatively judge the series would just be pointless. Even if in sharing my impressions I affected the impressions of others, it would neither invalidate the original impressions that they had as something that helped to govern the trajectory of the present, nor would any shift in perception at present alter the past. We could all decide we hated toilets tomorrow and go back to shitting in the woods, and it wouldn't change the fact that toilets were one of the greatest inventions of all time because of their prolonged popularity. Paper parchment, for instance, may now be more widely beloved than papyrus parchment and could feasibly rank higher than papyrus on the list of all-time greatest things, but it wouldn't mean that papyrus suddenly wouldn't be on the list. Just like how any list of the greatest games of all time will still prominently feature Super Mario Bros, even if Grand Theft Auto 5 is the most popular video game in existence. I realize with all of this preface that it sounds like I'm about to make a negative review of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but that is not the case. I would score pretty much everything I've seen of the franchise between a 6 and an 8 out of 10. And to be clear, if I scaled back my universal appraisal of all good things to ever exist and just listed the anime and manga by their cultural impact and belovedness, JoJo falls into at least the top 3% without question. It is a 10 out of 10 by any standard that matters, and my opinions by no means fall into that category. I simply don't think it would be interesting for me to explain why JoJo is a 10 out of 10 to you in 2022. Aside from the fact that shit tons have been written about it, the franchise is simply embedded deep enough into culture at this point that it's not something to take someone's word for. When you know that something has the impact that JoJo does, and it seems in any way relevant to your interests, you would do yourself a disservice not to investigate it on your own. Find out for yourself if and how much you care, and don't rely on me to figure out how I think you should feel and why. JoJo is so memorable because there's so much going on inside of it on so many different levels. That is to say, like Jack the Ripper, it has a ton of hooks in it. There's the generations and world-spanning narrative, the audacious character designs, the constant references to Western music and high fashion, the endless barrage of unique powers being used in increasingly preposterous ways, and of course the posing. But those are more the broad strokes and consistencies of what is much more than that, a story packed with so goddamn many characters, powers, and individual weird moments that two fans could have wildly different perspectives on what makes the series good. Some people love Part 3 and hate Part 5. Some love Part 4 and hate Part 1. And probably out there somewhere someone who hates Part 2, but I've never met him. Everyone has their favorite Jojo, their favorite stand, their favorite fight, their favorite meme, and so on and so forth. And it's that incredible breadth which gives it the ability to appeal to so many different people so strongly. And yet, perhaps my biggest contention with Jojo is the ways in which it is narrow. Tonally, the series tends to hang in the space of over-the-top action spectacle, scatological humor, and suspense. There are tinges of horror and mystery and even some slice of life in places, but as you get into the rhythm of each arc, it tends to follow a very predictable formula, and the dialogue basically runs in circles as characters exclaim again and again how impossible whatever someone is doing ought to be. The anime especially is cacophonous. Characters are usually yelling, everything has an over-the-top sound effect attached, and the music goes headlong into the maximum degree of whatever emotion it's trying to convey. All versions of the story are visually cacophonous as well, with characters weirdly posed and framed as often as possible, dressed in wacky costumes, and drawn in as much detail as time allows for with bright popping colors. It's a little bit of everything all the time on the audio, visual, and narrative front, with the exception of subtlety. You'll find very little of that anywhere in this story. And also women. But again, talking about Jojo in too broad of strokes doesn't tell enough of the story, because there is just so much going on that it can't be so easily reduced. Like for instance, I generally don't appreciate gross out humor or imagery that sets out to be deliberately repulsive. In part 3, for instance, I rolled my eyes at the poop jokes, and I was about to do the same in part 5 when one of the guys pissed in a teapot and challenged Giorno to drink it. But when Giorno's solution to dealing with that was to transform his tooth into a type of jellyfish that can suck up all the piss and make it look like he drank it, I'm just stupefied and impressed that Araki not only had this idea, but could do so because he had already established the particular bizarre powers of these characters in a way that could lead to this situation. A lot of Jojo can be summarized as incredibly smart ways to make incredibly dumb shit happen. None of it makes any sense at all, but it's explained in such a way that nonetheless satisfies our desire for cohesion in the narrative. We get why things can happen even if there's no possible explanation for how, and that's enough to work with and even be impressed by just for how any form of logic could be constructed to satisfyingly lead to its conclusions. At the end of episode 4, when we find out that the stand user seemed to be nowhere because actually he had put a second boat around the boat and was moving in the gap between the boats, I feel like I'm the idiot if I ask how that's possible. My very first impression of Jojo Part 5, rather infamously, is that I think it looks like garbaggio, and by this I had meant that the incredibly harsh shading and ludicrous detail on the character art clashes with the bright simplistic backgrounds in a way that makes them look like they don't belong there. It also makes them difficult to animate, leading to a lot of stiff movement and awkward pose transitions, particularly in conversational scenes where less effort was concentrated. I also think that a lot of shots are awkwardly framed, likely as a result of translating manga panels which don't conform to any particular aspect ratio, and filling them out to be the consistent 16:9 TV framing without altering the compositions to fit that aspect ratio better. This isn't to say that the show never looks great. In fact, there are some neat tricks in the animation to convey the mind-bending nature of the powers, and moments which clearly had more care and attention put into making an impression. Ultimately though, the layers of my feelings go much deeper than what I can justify by just using technical jargon. Frankly, I just don't love most of Araki's character designs. A lot of the outfits are kinda dumb, and they clash with one another in ways that create a garish cacophony of color. And this isn't me being against weird fashion or anything either, as there are plenty of ridiculous outfits that I like, although context certainly plays a big role in it. I'm sure that most of these designs actually would work for me in individual portraits with aesthetic cohesion, but seeing the outfits running around and fighting in a mostly realistic setting only emphasizes their garishness. I'm sure to many that is literally the appeal in and of itself, and I even think that the previous seasons had stronger overall visual cohesion, but with Part 5 in particular, the sight of these characters in these outfits on these backgrounds triggered my cringe response. And again, even that I'm sure is the point for many, and there is plenty of deliberate cringe humor in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But I do enough cringing every time I look in a mirror or speak out loud, so I don't need to seek more of that from the shows I watch. Luckily, as the story progresses, David Productions doesn't stick to the pale blue skies as common backdrops for the story, and the designs fare much better under dramatic and darker lighting, perhaps at their best in episodes set at night, when the desaturated colors flow into one another better. Since I have this PS2 game footage on screen, I can actually just tell you exactly what I think would be the perfect color aesthetic for this entire arc. And I do think the anime tapped into this in places, but the game looks so good. Jojo is also an incredibly violent series with a penchant for shock and awe twists in its episodic stories, and these moments tend to elicit a similar cringe response from me, which again I know to be deliberate, but for me is sometimes unfavorable. That isn't to say I don't enjoy violent media, but I tend to enjoy the more cathartic, tension-dispersing types of violence over the horrific or tense violence. For instance, when Bucciarati unzips his arm and throws it at the guy that's about to stab his friend, that violence cathartically disperses the scene's tension. But the following moment of him unzipping the guy's head from his neck is closer to horrific. But since we see the zipper right before the head comes off, and we understand the powers, there is enough time for us to brace for it, and the portrayal of the decapitation is almost humorous, not to mention that it still constitutes the removal of a threat. Giorno causing the mafia boss to commit suicide at the end of episode 4 hangs somewhere in between cathartic and horrific, whereas the random old man getting murdered by that gang leader's stand is squarely horrific, but it also has narrative and dramatic purpose that is compelled by that emotion that is elicited in the scene. Whereas episode 7's torture dance, I can only really describe as sadistic. It is unique in concept and memorable in execution, but not really appealing to me, and that it doesn't feel narratively justified, and kinda makes the characters performing it harder to like and relate to. Yeah, the enemy stand user tried to kill them, and yes, this is supposedly done to get information out of him, but it doesn't work for reasons that their leader already predicted, and it's being done at a moment when this person isn't a threat, in a scene that has only got tension in how we wouldn't want to feel what the bad guy is feeling. That sort of gleeful sadism doesn't personally resonate with me. I could easily sit around and come up with uniquely horrific and or comical ways to torture someone, but it isn't something I necessarily want to do or see in particular. Anime for me tends to live or die on the strength of its characters and their chemistry. I like seeing the effects that someone's actions have on their community and to examine the tapestry of cause and effect that an action ripples out through a story. And for that reason, I liked Giorno's backstory, because it's all about the effects of people's actions on one another. Giorno's mother and stepfather neglected and abused him, so he became quiet and sad. However, by showing compassion towards what he didn't realize was a gang boss, he earned that person's respect and protection, which in turn changed him into someone that both admires gangsters while living with a strong sense of justice. Likewise, when he spares Bucciarati's life for clearly resenting the gangsters who've been selling drugs to kids and therefore earns his respect, as well as when Pulpo earns his disrespect and is murdered, sending ripples through the gang's power structure. These moments where the consequences of one's actions shape the lives of others are the most interesting to me in the show. Not so engaging to me are long periods of suspense and build-up in which characters just wonder about what's going on and think through every possibility. Basically, any part of the battles in between the consequential moments when powers are being used or revealed tend to leave me impatiently wanting to know the point. Redundant explanations and rationalizations tend to aggravate me. I don't feel like I need to know every single thing that goes through a character's head that dictates their decision making when a lot of it could simply be inferred. I also find the chemistry between most JoJo characters aggravating more than entertaining. In the interactions, I am most often reminded that this story comes from a magazine aimed at 12-year-old boys, and the characters tend to act like little brats that I could never see wanting to be around. Always bickering, pranking one another, screaming about inconsequential differences of opinion, and bragging how much they can kick one another's ass are all personality traits which do the opposite of endearing me to the characters. On the other hand, some of their particular weirdness can be entertaining. I like the bit where Mista insists that one must eat at lunchtime, and his peculiar relationship with the 6 living bullets which comprise his stand. In isolation, the reasoning behind his stubbornness can be fun to consider, even if it often leads to obnoxious interactions with others. I like how Abacchio's troubled background in the police force left him jaded and bitter, and how this gave him a distrust of Giorno, which only even starts to be abated after he recognizes the crazy things Giorno's willing to do out of his trust for Bucciarati. But I don't find the interactions that this lack of trust leads to all that interesting. A lot of these minor experiential aggravations also stand to be abated simply as setup to something that could be satisfying in the long run. Part of me wonders what it would take for Giorno to actually earn that guy's trust, generating some anticipation that, if the show can deliver on it well, would make it more satisfying to have been sitting on it up to that point. Certain arcs in this story are satisfying when they reach conclusion, but others hang in the balance for too long or don't have much payoff. The first time that I was impressed with a story arc in Part 5 was during the battle on the train, in which which the main crew are under attack by Prosciutto and Pesci. Prosciutto is by far the smartest and deadliest opponent the squad has faced yet, with his Grateful Dead stand rapidly aging anyone with a higher body temperature. Mista puts up an admirable fight against the two opponents, but is beaten to the point of appearing fully dead. All throughout this battle, and even for a couple of episodes beforehand, Prosciutto harangues the newcomer Pesci about his lack of resolve and unworthiness as a gangster hitman. As this goes on, we meet Pesci's stand, a fishing rod whose hook endlessly burrows towards the heart to kill its opponent. Even though Pesci seems bumbling, he exhibits a firm understanding of his stand power and can track all sorts of information about his enemies based on the way his line reacts to them. When Prosciutto is seemingly defeated and struck down in the spokes of the train, Pesci is moved to the realization that Prosciutto is still using his stand power actively through sheer resolve. This inspires Pesci so much that he stomps a random passenger's neck just to finally experience killing someone, and then breaks bad in awesome fashion, becoming, in my opinion, the first actually memorable villain in the season just by having an actual emotional arc. It is in this moment that I think Pesci earns the dramatic right to pose an actual threat to the team. While I might have accepted that Mista could have died by the scenario with Prosciutto, it would have been unsatisfying for just another bit villain to have taken out a main character that only ever got to show his stuff in taking out other bit villains. However, with Pesci stepping into the shoes of a real character, and with the moral gray area that even the heroes of the story occupy, he became an enemy worth rooting for, and to enough of a degree that he could have killed a main character, and I would have believed it justified dramatically. It is equally satisfying, though, that Pesci instead pushes Bucciarati into using sticky fingers in the most outlandish and awesome of ways to essentially commit temporary suicide to escape his stand, and then to punish Pesci's foolhardiness by reminding us that someone newly badass just won't cut it against an opponent who's been badass for a long time. Even though Bucciarati has been built up as the biggest badass and coolest guy on the team from the start, it's only in this battle that the reality of the character lines up finally with his reputation to make him a character I will always remember and care about from now on. I feel the following battle does something similar for Giorno, though his opponent isn't as dramatically fleshed out, but is nonetheless intriguing. I love the idea of an AI being deliberately raised wrong so that he'll come out as evil and sadistic as possible, and also the idea of that power being a sort of flip side of the golden experience coin, from which Giorno learns a new way of using his stand. Giorno is brought similarly past the verge of death in this fight and emerges looking as badass as he's been built up to be, while establishing the main way that his power will be used from now on for its inventive healing properties. Unfortunately, this is followed immediately by the barely animated nor interesting White Album fight, but we don't really need to talk about that. Less satisfying to me than either of these arcs is that of the only relevant woman in the whole show, Trish. When she is first introduced as the boss's daughter that the crew needs to protect until they can bring her to her father, Trish speaks only once to demand a bunch of ludicrous and spoiled things from the boys. She never gets any of it thanks to Narancio getting attacked after shopping, and from that point she basically sulks around in the background for like 10 straight episodes, saying almost nothing and just along for the ride. The first time we really get any kind of emotion out of her is right before meeting her father, when she trips out about her lack of agency or knowledge about what's to come in this scenario, and is comforted by Bucciarati before they both head into the elevator to reach the boss, whereupon it is revealed that he summoned her there only so that he could kill her himself. As incredibly badass as the following scenes, which introduce the mind-bending stand powers of King Crimson against Bucciarati, are, Trish is pretty much passed out through all of it. Her dad is presented as someone basically so paranoid that he's become the top guy in the mafia just so that he'll be able to keep anyone off of his tail for the fact that he's a straight-up murderer keeping bodies under his floorboards. He's so paranoid, in fact, that he even dissociated from himself, as we will learn a couple of short arcs later when we meet his alternate persona. Bucciarati's battle here and his decision to turn against the boss because of realizing the kind of man that he is makes him even more of a cool dude, and gives the rest of his crew a chance to prove their loyalty to the cause once more. Except for Fugo, who I guess Araki left behind because he didn't want to draw that stupid ass hairdo anymore. I straight up did not miss this dude when he was gone from the show, even though his one fight was okay. After the King Crimson reveal, Trish finally gets an arc to herself aboard an airplane in which her stand is awakened and seems to talk to her in a similar way to her father's, but like a girl boss version. Her stand has the properties of rubber, though not gum, and she has a kind of fun battle against the Blob on an airplane, but this is practically all that she will ever do for the rest of the arc. I thought it seemed like a pretty useful power, but Trish's only real moment in the story is awakening to the will to fight, only to barely be asked to do it from then on. It's honestly hard to remember her for much more than the pouty look on her face, which is why I'm glad that Araki finally decided to write some decently cool girls with stands into part 6. The reveal of the boss's alter ego and seemingly main front-facing personality Doppio is a hilarious and memorable interpretation of dissociative identity disorder. It is offhandedly mentioned that people can even change in appearance when switching between personalities, but Jojo takes this to the most literal extreme it can with Doppio and Diavolo. The gimmick of them communicating by way of Doppio being made to hear a ringing phone, identify any random object as the call device, and then answer messages from the boss is a fascinating take on the relationship that multiple personalities could have with one another, and the absolute loyalty that Doppio has for his boss's orders, his loyalty to himself that is, might be such that he could break his own mind into pieces just so he has a reason to be legitimately unable to identify himself. This character feels incredibly complete in this roundabout way, and makes him the perfect opponent to our main duo of like-minded wholesome gangsters. Doppio's battle against Risotto was also pretty badass, and a more dramatic way to use the head of the assassins that the main boys have already spent the whole show mopping through to establish the personalities and potential powers of the boss instead of having a fight with him. It's also right here that Abbacchio is abruptly killed. Araki gave him one more big use for his powers, and then I have to imagine just became tired of trying to come up with ideas for how it would have had to be factored into the final battle, a fate that's later going to befall Narancia during the final battle. While it was a little sad to see these characters go, it also didn't really feel as though I'd been given enough time to really care about them and feel the sting of their deaths more strongly. Abbacchio started off suspicious of Giorno and eventually wasn't really anymore, and that's all the development he really had beyond the backstory setting up his morals. Narancia is more so tragically struck down, just a kid with any kind of future he wanted ahead of him that's no more because he sacrificed his life to the cause of stopping the evil Diavolo. It's a sad thought, but there's a reason this death isn't given the seismic dramatic weight that will be given to finally sending off Bucciarati's spirit after hinting at his undead status for a while. The battle to reach the Colosseum through the Green Day and Oasis stands represents a kind of optimal version of the standard Jojo battle to me. We are introduced to the stand in a horrifying and wantonly violent context, and multiple main characters have to struggle using their powers combined to compete with two enemies also using their powers together. As cool as many of the stand powers are in this show, it's exceedingly rare that they get used in combination, and while I realize I might be asking a lot of an already very imaginative series, I do think I would be more interested in a series which took better consideration of how different characters' powers could be used in combination so that they can all fight at once instead of having to come up with reasons that most of the characters are just out of the fight most of the time, including even still a few characters in this one. I like that the villains here were given a little bit of backstory, establishing how their already twisted personalities were only given more time to flourish after the awakening of their stands, and also the breakdown of their relationship over one's death, even though I still think that the Gimp Shark character is very obnoxious, and the whole way that the chase that he has swimming through the ground with Bruno is presented is very weird. The man who turns out to have found the solution to beating Diavolo is none other than our buddy Polnareff, whom I remember as vaguely likable from Part 3. How everything in the final battle plays out is fun to watch but convoluted to explain. It's basically just deliberately complicated to justify itself as a significantly bigger, higher consequence battle than any of the ones that happened previously, which is fine. It still weirdly doesn't have much of the characters using multiple stands at the same time, even though everyone left is involved in the fight, but eventually Giorno unlocks his stand's God mode and puts Diavolo in an endless mind prison of experiencing his own death over and over again eternally. Pretty wild shit. Then he becomes the leader of the gang, of course, mission accomplished. We also end up with a little backstory arc about a haunting stone that was trying to cause the death of Bucciarati, and when stopped by Mista, instead differently predicted Bucciarati's death, along with Narancia and Abbacchio's. I like the horror tinge that this gives the entire arc, knowing that things could have played out very differently depending on if Mista hadn't changed how the stone would take its victims, though I don't really know what the relevance is long term. All told, did I have a golden experience watching Jojo Part 5? I pretty much enjoyed it. Giorno Giovanni himself, while generally a cool dude with some really ridiculous powers, didn't really end up having to grow much as a character past the introduction, and so it really ends up being Bruno Bucciarati's show for the most part. He's the one given easily the most complete arc in the show, all the way up to his permanent death in the final episodes. Of his squad mates, Mista is easily the most memorable, not only for the particularities of his personality and his relationship with his stand, but because Araki found the most unique uses for that stand out of pretty much anything he invented in this arc. Narancia is cute and could be fun to watch sometimes, but his Aerosmith stand wasn't really all that inspiring. The other two had neat looking stands with very specific purposes that sound cool when explained, but don't get fleshed out past that, nor do their personalities. Most of the enemy stands were pretty forgettable, though I think the combination attacks from Grateful Dead and Fisher King were the most memorable, and the way that Bruno used his stand in that scene is easily my favorite stand usage in the entire show, and possibly my new fetish. All in all, the pacing and promise of the characters felt stronger in Part 5 to me than they did in Part 3, and so I'm inclined to consider it amid the better JoJo parts and to score it at least in the strong 7 to light 8 range. I wouldn't say that I was disappointed to have spent my time watching the series, even if it was something I'd passed on watching previously, and only ended up giving a second chance because my husband likes it. I had lodged JoJo into the category of something that I would simply have to read the whole manga for at some point because I didn't think the anime series was worth the time investment. But it makes a big difference sometimes to watch something with someone who is already enthusiastic about it and knows that I'm not very likely to actually start reading the manga anytime soon. JoJo is the kind of series that it helps to know about as a cultural reference point because there are so many particular standout moments that it's hard for fans of the show not to make reference to it in any kind of bizarre context. There's always going to be a meme that someone latches onto from the show. Personally, I'm into taking phone calls from nearby rocks. Anyways, the first 12 episodes of Part 6 are out on Netflix at the time of this writing, and I've already watched them. I think the show's good. The visual aesthetic passes better from the start than that of Golden Wind, and even though it's locked to one location, it does a lot with the premise of being a prison show. Jolene is probably my favorite JoJo yet, if only because she's by far the most centrally focused and proactive in the plotline of possibly any of them so far. Some of the stand powers and wacky characters have been pretty fun, but nothing quite makes the splash that Weather Report does with Araki's audacious idea of what weather control can do, and really funny profile that he's introduced with. I will probably talk about that show in another video once it's fully out. If you haven't kept up with what I've been up to lately, be sure to check out the Anime Alphabet series, which consists of long-form, retrospective takes on classic shows like Sailor Moon, Digimon, Full Metal Alchemist, The Legend of the Galactic Heroes, Haibane Renmei, my most recent one on Ninja Scroll, and my upcoming one on Eureka 7. Give a look to my music review channel as well as the ASE Presents channel where I do multiple podcasts, which will all be linked in the description below, and support me via Substack or Patreon, which are also linked down below, and support me on goldenwitch.substack.com or through patreon.com/goldenwitchfire. I'm at goldenwitchfire on all social media and payment platforms, and I'm telling you to always remember to never forget anime forever.